Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight for our latest program sponsored by Massachusetts Peace Action. Massachusetts Peace Action is a local anti-war group here in Massachusetts. Today, we'll be having a discussion about the Israel lobby and US policy towards Palestine and Israel. This discussion tonight will be conducted by Jeff Klein, a board member of Massachusetts Peace Action, a longtime activist, a contributor to the publication Mondoweiss. Jeff is a member of Mass Peace Action's Palestine-Israel working group and has written a lot about related issues. If you Google his name or check out Mass Peace Action's YouTube page. Jeff will be in dialogue tonight with Phil Weiss. Phil is a co-founder of the publication Mondoweiss, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, a very important publication for that covers Israel and Palestine. So with that, I will now pass the floor to Jeff.
Thanks, Amar. It's my pleasure to introduce Phil Weiss. We've known each other for quite a while, although we've only met in person a couple of times as far as I can remember. Phil, as Amar said, is the founder of the website Mondoweiss, which has developed into an absolutely indispensable source of information and opinion relating to Palestine and Israel and the wider Middle East, and especially to US policy around questions of Israel and Palestine. It's grown in participation and influence. It now has a full-time correspondent in Palestine and Israel, and over the years has been a venue where many, many authors and opinion writers on our issue have been given a chance to publish. And that includes me. I have to thank Phil for his generosity to wannabe authors or budding authors. And over the years, I've had 30 or so articles on Mondoweiss, and you know, when the spirit moves me, usually Phil is agreeable to publishing my thoughts on that. So without any more introduction, Phil, maybe we could start, if you could just explain the origin and a little bit of the history of Mondoweiss and how it got from where it started to where it is today, and then we'll proceed after that.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for all your contributions over the years, and thanks for hosting me tonight, and thanks to Mass Peace Action for having this event. You know, obviously, you know, I'm in a grassroots movement. I'm involved with the grassroots movement, and there's so many important organizations around the country, and Mass Peace Action is one of them. And so it feels like being home and in my own community, and I love that. To answer your question, I was a very different person 16 years ago when this site began than I am today. I was a mainstream journalist in New York. I was working for a lot of glossy magazines, and I had a column at the New York Observer, a weekly newspaper that a little irreverent, but also a little bit social. It was a little cachet. And I wanted to start a blog because everyone was starting a blog. And I was 50 years old. I've been a journalist a long time. I wanted to try out the latest form of journalism. And so my editor gave me a blog and called it Mondoweiss because it was going to be about my thoughts and on the world or whatever I wanted to talk about. And so there was that element of personal vanity, and that I had something to say that people would want to hear, that, you know, right now I regard as kind of ridiculous now, when the web has so transformed our forms of communication and made them so serious. I think the web has had a fantastic effect on human communication. Obviously, it's had some bad effects too. Anyway, so it began as this kind of personal website where I got to hold forth on various things, very trivial things. But one thing was that I was very much against the Iraq War, and and that was not a popular position in the mainstream media, even in 2005, 2006, when it began. And so I began to explore that, and that led more and more to issues of Jewish identity, the Israel lobby, Israel's role in promoting or helping to push that war, the Israel lobby's interest in having that war, just the various factors, ways in which Israel was tied into American foreign policy. And I'd never been to Israel or Palestine, and I went for the first time on Jared Kushner's dime in 2006. Jared Kushner then owned the New York Observer, and he paid for my trip in that summer, the Lebanon war summer of '06. And, you know, everyone, I'm sure that many of the people who are on this call have had a similar experience to mine, in that they went over there, they went to Palestine, and the scales fell from their eyes. And it's a very disturbing thing to see. And when you meet Palestinians, and you understand the effects of our policies, and you understand the effect of the Jewish community, of which I'm a member, I should say I'm Jewish. So Judaism or Jewish culture always very important to me. I'm always very proud of that. Israel is not something I ever felt very proud of. I wasn't really connected, as I should have said. I mean, being 50 and not having gone to Israel, that's true of most American Jews, or half of American Jews haven't gone. Since that time, I've been back a dozen times, and the website slowly transformed from a blog to a website as I became more obsessive about this question, the Israel question, in American public life. And you know, I began to take myself less seriously and the issues more seriously. And as I did, I made more and more friends, and joined a community of which you were a fairly longstanding member, Jeff. And I was more of a newbie, but learned a lot from that community. And I've been proud to, you know, use my communication skills to try to augment the impact of that community in America. And so now it's 15, 16 years later, and we employ a few people, and the sort of self-indulgent personal stuff that I used to write about a long time ago, I don't do that anymore, and I'm happy not to do it. And although I certainly hold forth on my opinion about these matters, there are many points of view on the website.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And I guess most people listening are probably part-time readers of Mondoweiss, at least. And it's interesting to hear that Mondoweiss at one point intersected with Trump World directly.
It did.
So one of the interesting developments in Mondoweiss is the widening horizon of authors that appear on the website, and particularly now it's an outlet for a lot of Palestinian voices to speak directly. And maybe you could say how that came about, that evolution.
Well, I think that you and I are both Jewish, or come out of that Jewish community. We have a special understanding of that community. We have insight into the ways that our community and its values and its traditions and understandings have played a crucial role in American foreign policy. Excuse me. So those are singular insights that you and I have as two older, white guys in this webinar. You can't be involved in this issue very long without realizing that the true leaders of the movement to bring freedom to Palestinians, those leaders are Palestinians. And they have long experience in this work. They have a better understanding of how to organize, I think, than anyone, obviously, on this question. One can question tactics here and there and had your 2 cents, but we became aware, I became aware fairly soon, and especially after Adam Horowitz joined on as co-editor in 2008 or so, that we had to have Palestinian voices, or, it's very limited, the window on what's going on. And, Americans need more windows on this on this issue, and the Jewish American one is an important window, but the Palestinian one is kind of the premier window. And I would say that the great thing, one of the great developments, and is that the American media are more and more beginning to bring that voice in, the Palestinian narrative. Finally, we're getting to hear the Palestinian narrative in mainstream venues. And someday, you know, I'll be out of work. I mean, that would be a good day when I'm out of work. So.
Well, speaking as a retired person, being out of work is not a bad thing.
That's great. Are you busier than ever, Jeff?
Yes, but on my own timetable, on my own schedule, which is a good thing. So just for the people who are watching, in case it rings any alarms to see two white men speaking on this issue, let me explain that our focus is going to be on U.S. policy toward Israel and Palestine, and not that we're pretending to be giving voice to the Palestinians themselves. I mean, I think Phil's perspective, and certainly mine and Mappa's, is that as people in the United States, what happens in Palestine is for Palestinians and Israelis to decide. What happens in the United States in terms of U.S. policy is for U.S. citizens to try to influence. And that's really where Mondoweiss, has focused, and mostly Phil's work explicitly has focused. So that's really what we're going to be looking at in this webinar. And of course, there are lots of other opportunities that we've provided and will provide in the future to hear Palestinian voices give their perspective, which is, very important, but that's not the topic for today. So Phil, now that you've reminded me that Mondoweiss has been going for 16 years, could you sort of comment a little bit on what the trajectory has been in terms of observing U.S. policy and U.S. reporting from about Israel and Palestine has been during that period, and what, in your view, has changed, if anything?
It's a great question, and it's sort of the ball game. I mean, it's the $64,000 question, right? Because reporting is so key to the American understanding of these issues. I would say that if you recall in 2003, I mean, I'm just going to be a little bit anecdotal about this. To answer your question in a general fashion first, a lot has changed in the last 15 years. And there have been major interventions over those 15 years, beginning with soon after my website started, it was mine then, Walden Mearsheimer published their paper, The Israel Lobby, which was a shock heard around the world, exposing the Israel lobby's role in sort of almost controlling foreign policy in this area. So that was in 2006. There have been several Israeli attacks on Gaza since then, 2008 and 2009, 12, 14. And these events have been the fact that Israel has no imagination about how to deal with its Palestinian problem or the Palestinian issue has become more and more evident to Americans. The only thing they know how to do is kill Palestinians and persecute Palestinians. And a lot has changed, but I think that the crucial thing that has happened is that ideas that were marginal when this website began are now coming into the mainstream. Now, this is a truism of all grassroots organizing, I think, on very hard, tough issues. But I was writing today about Tony Judt, right, who wrote Israel, the Alternative in 2003. He said, why not one democratic state? Why do we need a Jewish state? That's a 19th century idea. It's an anachronism. We should be past that. And he was met with the New York Review of Books, where he published it, has a large Jewish audience. There was outrage, and the magazine all but apologized for publishing the piece. Today, the idea that there should be one democratic state in Israel and Palestine has been well advanced in progressive circles, obviously. And we have played our role in doing that. But today, I mean, Peter Beinart, a liberal, formerly liberal Zionist, is for one democratic state. There are Congress people, a couple of them anyway, who I believe are for one democratic state. This is kind of revolutionary. And there are major human rights organizations that have flatly called what Israel does apartheid. And again, to go back to my earlier frame of reference, when Jimmy Carter said that in 2006,
Right.
he was drummed out of the Democratic Party, really, and for notioning it. And so now you have a lot more people are saying it. It's not being picked up so much by the media as much as we would hope. And certainly the Congress is not reflecting that. But I think it's it's a long arc. And so what I guess I've described to you is, what I see as great progress, but that has not really changed the Palestinian conditions. Palestinian conditions are worse than they were 15 years ago. But I think the American awareness of what's going on has certainly changed to the better. And we certainly see that in the polling on the Democratic side, and even of young evangelicals who are showing more and more sympathy to Palestinians. I don't, Jeff, I'm sorry, I rambled. I don't know if that answered your question.
Go. I think it's more interesting for people to hear, sort of personal view and anecdotes than a sort of a political lecture on this kind of question. So feel free. Obviously, as you say, and as those of us who follow this issue also know, public opinion, especially among Democrats, has moved considerably on this question in a more sympathetic view toward the Palestinians and being more critical of Israel. But U.S. policy has changed very little during the same period. So what's your view on how that disconnect works and why?
Well, I think most of the viewers of this session know what AIPAC is, the Israel Lobby Organization. It's sort of the lead pro-Israel organization in Washington. And one of the sort of guides in my work, was a speech by the head of AIPAC, Howard Core, probably 10 years ago already, in which he, with some I felt it was a little bit hysterical, but he was saying it was a fire and brimstone speech about how America is changing and America is turning. The anti-Israel forces are advancing on Washington, and he says they're on the campuses. They're in the left. You see them on social media, and it was just this kind of like juggernaut of pro-Palestinian sympathy that Core was describing. Now, he was doing this in order to raise money and get to rally his base to go talk to Congress and tell them about these horrible things that are going on in the country. But I say that it's been a guide because he accurately described the ways in which certain sectors of American public opinion and public culture were being taken over by pro-Palestinian or high solid sympathy to Palestinian opinion. Again, this was 10 years ago, and he was being a little too forward-thinking, as I also am forward-thinking. So he and I shared that kind of scenario of what was going to happen, and what he was offering was a sort of vision that has come to pass. And why I bring it up is it answers your question in the sense that as Core was describing this kind of to use the Macbeth metaphor, the woods of Dunsinane, ultimately, Macbeth knows his goose is cooked when the forest itself moves up toward the castle. So he was describing this kind of growing public just this threatening mob that was coming. And what Core said is that we are going to hold on to the Congress, we are going to hold on to the White House, and there again, we're going to hold on to the media, in so many words. And there again, I think that he's accurate in that the Israel lobby is largely an elites driven organization, unlike MPAC, which is a grassroots driven organization. And that classic conflict tension between the elites and the grassroots is one in which he's in the turrets of the castle and running around the battlements. And I think that what you're asking about is that these turrets, they've managed to hole up in the castle and in these sort of privileged, very privileged places, and they have them still, but they don't have the grassroots. They don't have the fields and the forests of public opinion, but they do have the White House. They do have Congress. They do have the editorial boards of the leading papers, and we're breaking into Congress. But I think that it was definitely the strategy of the Israel lobby to hold on to the elites. This is where we work. This is our territory. We can, as an AIPAC guy famously said to 20 years ago, look, this napkin, I could get 76 senators to sign it tomorrow. And that's what we do. We get senators to sign what we write. And that power is beginning to ebb, but they still got it, man.
Now they can only get 50 senators to sign the napkin.
I think you're right. I think you're right.
It reminds me that, going back some decades, the situation was that the Democratic Party at all levels was pretty united in sort of, unconditional support for Israel, while at least parts of the Republican Party were fairly skeptical. For some of you, it's ancient history, but the last president that really read the Riot Act to Israel and made them back off was Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s. And since then, we've had a partial flip, right? The Republican Party is now unanimously, fanatically pro-Israel, at least in their public expression. And the Democrats are a little bit divided, certainly at the base, very much divided, maybe a majority on the pro-Palestinian side. But even in Congress, as you say, there are some divisions. There's still only a small group of explicitly pro-Palestinian voices in Congress, but a larger number of people, Democrats, who are at least a little bit hesitant to be full-on, cheerleaders for Israel. That's a change. But why is it that still, given that the base of the Democratic Party, the Democratic voters, and a lot of Republican voters too, have changed, why it's so hard to move, the public policy? Obviously, inertia is part of it, but there are other factors. What do you see as the obstacles for more change politically on this?
Well, Jeff, actually, I'd be really interested to hear your answer to that question as well. But to go first, I would say, in fairness to Israel and its lobby in our country, the first thing I would say before I get to the kind of nuts and bolts of the politics, I think that Israel was an answer in 1947 and 1948 when it was created. It was an answer to a really important historical question that had plagued modern society and Western Europe and Eastern Europe as well for 150, 200 years, maybe longer, but was the sort of the role of Jews in Europe. And what was this people without the stateless people who had kind of a special role in some of these societies that was, but also who were subject to enormous persecution, culminating in the Holocaust. That was the Jewish question. And how is Western society, how is modern civilization going to deal with that group? And so again, I mean, it culminates in one of the greatest tragedies of human history, and greatest, I mean, worst genocides of human history. Obviously not limited to Jews, but with a special focus on Jews. The Holocaust had many victims. But I think that when society arrives, the powers that be arrive tortuously at a decision, as the powers that be did from 1917 or so with the Balfour Declaration by the leading, by the British Empire, as a major document of World War I, the Balfour Declaration, how we're going to redivide the colonies of the world post-World War I, leading up to the UN Declaration, the Special Committee on Palestine in 1947 coming up with partition. This is something that these powerful people had debated in earnest for, decades, and they came up with the idea of a Jewish state and an Arab state. And I don't think that, and that was a decision that was re-upped, if you will, with the Oslo process in the 90s and Madrid, when once again the world said, well, we're for partition. This is the only way to allow both peoples to get along or to live here, is to create one state for the Jews and one state for Palestinians. And so I think that if world powers come to that understanding, it's very hard to dislodge it. I mean, to a great historical problem. And there's a fear that dislodging it is going to cause a lot of violence, which there is very high likelihood of a lot of violence in Israel and Palestine. But to the nuts and bolts, I think that the role of Jews in the Democratic Party is just very important. Jews have been a central part of the Democratic Party coalition, as important, I think, in their way as African Americans are. Jews, a smaller group, but among the donors, the big donors to the Democratic Party are, that list is dominated by Jewish people. And the understanding is that Jews are for Zionism. Now that's changing, and it should change, but the way that political consultants from, I believe, from Harry Truman on to Jimmy Carter to Lyndon Johnson to Bill Clinton interpreted that is that, hey, 90% of the Jews are for Israel. They are the war chest for this party, and we are going to stick with it. We're on Israel's side. So that I think is the main reason for the political support. And I should say that this isn't just a Rube Goldberg device where you put in a dollar over here and you get influence here. I mean, this is the Jewish community, 90% by some estimates, 95% by other estimates. I mean, a large percentage of Jews really support Israel and regard it and some of them regard it as an existential question, like this is what is going to make us safe, having this state that was created in violence on someone else's lands with ethnic cleansing of 750,000 people, who many of whom are refugees who want to come back, whose lands have been stolen, property have been stolen, never been compensated, who are second-class citizens and apartheid, subjects of apartheid in that land. Jews can still think that this arrangement is good for Jews. I don't think it's good for Jews. But I think that when you think of how important police reform is in the Black community right now, in a very, sincere, genuine, deep way, I think that for Jews, Zionism was a kind of a central creed and ethos of the Jewish community for many years, as this is what we need. And I think that to overcome that is a struggle. And so the political struggle I described of coming up against the Israel lobby in Washington is one thing, and Palestinians are playing a very important role in breaking down the power of the Israel lobby. But I still see my role as trying to help the Jewish community grow past this idea of Jewish nationalism as this sort of Marcus Garvey answer to the issue of persecution.
I mean,
I'm
not
sorry,
only
that was
the ironies of that view that somehow Israel is vital and not Germany and not France and not Britain. You know, we can get back to that, but I don't want to let pass. You mentioned the Balfour Declaration, which of course is ancient history in a lot of ways, literally as well as figuratively. But just for those who it has a relevance today because it's symbolic of the sort of reorientation of the Zionist movement of Israel politically today in the world scene. I mean, the British Empire, for a variety of reasons, thought it was in their interest to promote the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. And there were many reasons for that, but not among them was any love for the Jewish people on behalf of Balfour and his ruling class in Britain. They thought it was politically would help the war effort in all kinds of ways, partly because they had this exaggerated and anti-Semitic idea of how powerful the Jews were and that they would all support this. But also, it was true then, and it's still true today, that Zionism is a kind of solution for people who want to get rid of the Jews in their country. And that was part of the motivation of Balfour. And ironically, it's part of the international alignment that Israel is associating itself with today, right? The people who don't like Jews, but like Israel and like it because it's a solution to get rid of the Jews that they don't want to be near them. And Israel is responding by saying, yeah, those are our best allies today. Just like Arthur Balfour was in 1917, Israel is aligning itself around the world with countries that are explicitly anti-Semitic, covertly today, but definitely explicitly in their history. You know, Poland and Hungary and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and it has its fallout in the United States. I mean, the Israeli right has discovered that their potential best allies in the United States are not the liberal Jews, but the right-wing evangelicals in the United States. And they're very explicit about that. So there's a kind of realignment of Israel's alliances from the liberals to the sort of right wing, you know, in the United States and internationally. And of course, Netanyahu really, you know, sort of exhibited that, you know, fully aligning himself with the Republican Party very explicitly. And I wonder if you could comment. I have some thoughts about this issue of the evangelicals in the United States, but I wonder if you could comment from your point of view how that trajectory has developed and is developing in the future.
Well, Jeff, first I have a question though about what you said, and it's a great, you posed it in a perfect way, but I'm curious if Israel does become politicized fully in the manner in which you described, and it's the Republican Party that is its protector in the United States, and it loses the Democratic Party, what do you think that would mean for Israel? Wouldn't that be I should think that would be extremely worrying to Israel.
I think it is, but they have to make some choices in terms of their allies and what's available and what's not available. And as liberal opinion becomes more skeptical, they're relying more and more on the sort of fortress right wing, not just in the United States, but around the world also. And I guess I would say, whatever the sort of liberal pretensions of Zionism was earlier, of course, they were self-described socialists that were, some of the founders of Israel. The logic of an ethnic exclusive colonial state, which is, indisputably what Israel is,
yes,
is not liberal.
No.
and it's becoming clear to Israeli politicians that at least the right wing, which is very dominant in Israel, that, in this age, to be a racialized, ethnic state, implies that you have to have different kinds of allies than the ones you had when you were supposedly building a kibbutz utopia in the 1950s.
Yes.
And it was predictable if anyone really thought about it. Not most of us did not, but it's logical that was the development.
Yes.
You can't be a liberal colonialist.
No, and on those kibbutzes, they didn't allow Palestinians,
Yeah.
right there, including in places where, they were on Palestinian land, so a lot of this was baked in, or it was in the DNA or the seeds of this.
Yeah, without a doubt, without a doubt. And of course, back, before the creation of the State of Israel, people could be more explicit about it. It was common to use the terminology of colonialism in creating the pre-state Israel and the sort of Zionist integration. No one thought that was, that's become a little bit sort of disfavored and, in the current environment, but people were very explicit about it, that this was a colonial enterprise. I mean, the Jewish National Fund, the predecessor of it was the Jewish Colonial Fund. And Herzl talked about that and so on. So essentially the chickens are coming home to roost in this colonial enterprise, and they're looking for the logical allies for that. And it's not progressive and liberal thought, even though there's a kind of hangover, right, of support and fondness for Israel that is constantly being undermined by the reality of it.
Yes.
It's becoming harder and harder to support.
Although I'd say that, to answer your question about the time frame, and you would have some insight into this as much as I think I do, but certainly there was an anachronistic element to Zionism, certainly in the 40s, 50s. We were supposed to be decolonizing the world, and here you were creating a colonial entity of some sort. And one of the amazing, interesting things about American political history is that again and again, Black radicals raised this question in the American discourse. And so the SNCC brain trust in the 60s was raising this issue. And I think that, I don't have the facts right at hand, but Michael Fishbach goes into this in his book about the issue, a recent book, where, SNCC would say, what about the Palestine question? These people are as oppressed as we are, and they lost their funding. They had big Jewish funders who were very radical. They had radical Jewish friends, left-wing Jewish friends, who were left-wing up to this point, but they weren't questioning Zionism. I bring this up more to go to the timeline, which is that again and again, when the issue has been raised in the Democratic Party, it has been successfully repressed. And so I think that for all of us, one of the miracles of the last year is that this business, that this urgent question of oppression of based on race, Zionism is racism, the famous UN General Assembly resolution of 1975. This has been an urgent question on the left, but it's always been pushed down by elites and by the party leadership in the Democratic Party, and indeed by broad sections of the Democratic Party, which could not tolerate this discourse. And the miracle is that it's finally coming in. So your question to me is, why is it that this issue has never been politicized in any real way in America? America gives all this money and will never question its support for Israel. All presidents stand by Israel, our best friend, as Biden put it. Why is it suddenly becoming politicized? And I guess, everyone on this call, I think, and hopefully we'll be getting some of the participants, other participants will be unmuted before too long, but will have their own theory about what has happened. But the two things I would point to are, one, Black Lives Matter, and the revolution that we are seeing in American political culture maybe brought on by Trump, but where the progressive voices are really at the center of the democratic discourse. And that includes Black Lives Matter, and is a very urgent matter. And you cannot square the oppression of Palestinians under apartheid with supporting Black Lives Matter. It's impossible to reconcile. And so even politicians, I think, like Chuck Schumer, who's up for re-election next year, is afraid of getting primaried by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or some other progressive young person. And he's being careful on this issue because this issue could really bite him. The other factor I would point to, and maybe this is, I know that I could be accused of some narcissism here, but hey, it's my point of view, is that the Jewish community has grown and matured, and that there has been an active anti-Zionist discussion inside the American Jewish community. And I feel that that has, and here I even credit J Street, an organization I don't really like, but J Street has helped to politicize the question, has said there's more diversity in the Jewish community than just lockstep with Israel. And you have really important anti-Zionist group, Jewish Voice for Peace. You have a non-Zionist but renegade young Jewish group, If Not Now, which is challenging the leadership. So I think that that signal that the Jewish community is beginning to fracture is allowing other people to open their mouths. So those are the two factors I point to.
I definitely agree. And just in response to sort of your general wondering, why didn't this view take root sooner, that about Israel and its colonial nature. I mean, really, you explained a lot of it at the very beginning, that, the question of anti-Semitism in Europe and the United States, the Holocaust, the tremendous guilt that at least liberal-minded people felt about, allowing that to happen or failing to stop it, gave a kind of Jewish exceptionalism to their colonial enterprise. In other words, it's absolutely true what Tony Judt and others have said was, starting a colonial enterprise after the Second World War, when decolonization was the main trend in the world, it was obsolete. Well, it was given a kind of exceptional pass because of the guilty conscience of a lot of the world about treating the Jews. And, frankly, people looked at the Jews as anti-Semitism was weakening, this sort of personal anti-Semitism, looked at the Jewish founders of Israel, and they were people who looked like us, and the Arabs were this other that, we still in the colonial mindset didn't count very much, so Ben-Gurion and the early founders of Israel could tour the United States and, hey, we're Europeans, we're civilized, and we're fighting for a country among these uncivilized Muslim Arabs. And, that carried a lot of weight, particularly with that guilt of the experience of the Jews. And it's taken a generation or two for that exceptionalism to wear off and for people to take the blinders off and see this colonial enterprise for what it is. In the same way, people had no trouble understanding what South African apartheid was about. But it took a longer time, including for people like me, to really understand and grapple with the nature of Israel. So,
yes.
I hope that wasn't too elaborate.
No, I think you're right. And one anecdote I'd just like to relate is when I started this site, I remember walking around Columbia University campus in 2006 with a Palestinian friend. And it was late at night, we'd had something to drink, and he suddenly ran out into Broadway and said, he just raised his hand, my goal in life is to end Zionism. And I was like, whoa, I was shocked by that. And later I said to this guy, his name was Saif, I said, Saif, hey, can I quote you on my blog? I found that electrifying, what you said. I don't know what to think about it, but I found it shocking and electrifying. And he said, no. You can, that will destroy. So just that the degree of secrecy and fear and anxiety around that statement, a very simple declaration of what I think are good principles, it was shocking to me then. And now I think it's almost a commonplace that you'll hear people on certainly my own publisher has said, just tweeted recently when someone was talking about my goal is to, protect Israel from ever. He tweeted, my goal is to end Zionism.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a worthy goal in the Jewish community. And I have many friends who share it, and they're not, there's the apprehension and anxiety and fear and excitement and shock that accompanied that statement 15 years ago. For me, and I think for many others, is no longer there. And that's a great thing.
Yeah. And the real question is, what took so long?
Right.
For a lot of us.
Well, we have something to
I'm not
answer
including
for.
myself either.
Yeah, Jeff, you and me, we have to, a little self-flagellation comes in. We deserve it.
So we're going to go to questions in a little while, but before we do, I just wanted to ask you to comment on, one of the principal tactics in defending Israel these days is to accuse everyone who is critical of Israel of being anti-Semitic. And of course, that's ramping up. I mean, clearly you can see it in the publicity. And I wonder if you would comment on that. You've been the target of a lot of that. I often see Mondoweiss as being mentioned as the anti-Semitic website run by Phil Weiss. I wonder if you could comment on how that's being used as a tool to try to stifle opposition to Israel.
It's one of their main tools. The Israel lobby is to say that the criticisms are fueled by bigotry against Jews. And so the definition of anti-Semitism, which used to be fairly simple, which was hatred of Jews, which can manifest in many different ways, and in speech and violence and discrimination, that definition has now been replaced by a many-barreled definition, and some of the causes of or some of the qualifications are disliking Israel too much. So if you demonize Israel, if you single Israel out for criticism, and if you apply a double standard to Israel than to other places, or if you want to boycott Israel, or you deny the right of Jewish people to self-determination, then you're anti-Semitic. So I think that is key, is that actually that in this is a critical question ultimately, because and it's the Corbyn standard. This was successfully employed in England, the United Kingdom, to crush criticism of Palestine in the Labour Party, and to destroy Jeremy Corbyn to some degree. They destroyed his political future over this question, that he was too sympathetic to Palestinians. And they're going to try to use that same standard in our country. And what I find kind of interesting about it at heart is that these Jewish organizations that are pushing this definition, pro-Israel Jewish organizations, really do believe that to be part of being Jewish now is to be a Zionist. So they have created an identity of Judaism and Zionism. And so therefore it's logical that if you really don't like Zionism, by their understanding of the world, you're anti-Semitic. And I think that fundamental question of equating Judaism with support for Israel is just an enormously dangerous politicization of a religion. It's the worst things that people said about Islam after the 9/11 attack. It's turning a religion into a political credo to support, violent discrimination, violent attacks on other people. And I think that is ultimately going to be the battlefield inside the Jewish community, is this definition of Judaism as Zionism, and definitions of anti-Semitism as criticism of Zionism, that has to be unpacked and has to be taken apart. And it's going to be tumultuous and catastrophic for the Jewish world, but necessary too.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. You and I could go on a lot more.
Yeah, sorry if I went on
And I hope we have the opportunity to do that sometime face to face. I mean, it's a lot to
Yeah.
talk about in this stuff, but I do want to give some opportunity for people to ask questions. So, Amar, if you've been monitoring the questions in the chat, I wonder if you could sort of read some out, and especially to Phil, and I'll try to restrain myself as best I can from talking too much. So, Amar, can you?
Yeah, sure,
some
Jeff.
questions?
Yeah, so if people have questions, they can type it out in the chat and I'll keep an eye out for that, or they can use their raise hand feature on Zoom and we can unmute them and call on them to ask their question themselves. I'll kick it off with the question real quick. I agree with what Phil was saying about, yes, the media coverage seems to be somewhat improving recently. But just last night when I was looking at the news on my cell phone feed about the bombing of Gaza just yesterday. The headlines from the Washington Post and the New York Times, they were like Israel responds to incendiary balloons, and they're still very sympathetic to Israel. And if you're one of those people who are just reading the headlines, you would still get the perception that Israel is the victim here. So could you guys just kind of comment on that? And that's after all this massive upsurge of these massive protests that have been happening in Boston and all the stuff Phil was talking about with Black Lives Matter. And after this recent bombing of Gaza, it's like the New York Times and the Washington Post, they're still reporting on it the same way, it seems to me. So could you guys talk about that?
I agree with you that the progress is not always evident, and that there's also a kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back element to it. And the demonization of Hamas and Gazans and the cycle of violence narrative that, oh, one side does this, the other side does that, that's still powerful in the American media. So I can point you to a number of positives that we would never have seen before, but what you're describing is the traditional narrative that is still there. And yes, I agree, it's still there. Jeff, if you have a thought on it, I want to grab some water. So if you mind, I'll be 1 second.
Let me just say, in my opinion, this sort of subservience of the press, the mainstream press, to the power centers in our country is not unique to Israel. In other words, it's not a good career move for any journalist to sort of take an oppositional stance with regard to sort of U.S. imperial and capital interests in the United States, and we can see this same kind of subservience that we observe around Israel around questions like Iran and Russia and China, especially just today, the coverage of the Biden-Putin summit was just, so chauvinistic and so, subservient to the American narrative. So that's something that runs in our press in general, and it's one of the importance of the alternative press, of which Mondoweiss is one narrow interest, because the mainstream is baked in to basically support the establishment, with a few exceptions here and there that basically help to prove the rule, so to speak. So Israel is no different in that. The press follows money and power, and their narrative will repeat it. And as long as the narrative among policymakers and the elite, especially in Congress, is predominantly pro-Israel, different coverage will be the exception rather than the rule. So anyway, that's let's go for some more questions.
All right, let's take the next question from Michael, then we'll take a question from Alex after that. So Michael.
Yeah, so my question is probably going to be a little difficult to answer, but it seems like at the same time we were telling ourselves and trying to tell the rest of the world that we were anti-colonial after World War II, we were finding a way to institute a neo-colonialism, especially in areas that had oil, like the Middle East and Indonesia, all throughout the world, we had this desire, I guess, to take over empires that had been British or French or Dutch or whatever. And the Middle East always seemed to be a spot that we wanted to control the oil supply. I guess in the event that we ever got into another war, we wanted to be able to control it. And so we had this really tight friendship with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and other countries all throughout the time period. And I'm wondering, sometimes we look at Israel like it's not right in the middle of the Middle East. I mean, somehow we lift it out as like it's an island, but I'm curious about how the politics of moving oil, like through pipelines or tankers, might have played into how Israel has had a special relationship, I guess, especially after 67 when they did so well in the war. It seems like we've had certain readjustments over the years with Israel. There was the pre-67 relationship, and I guess after the right wing took over in 77, they became even more friendly or something like that. I don't quite understand it, but I know the relationship seems to have changed over the years. But the fact that they're kind of like our big aircraft carrier in the Middle East seems to be the one stable element. So I'm kind of wanting to understand that better.
Jeff, I'm curious to hear your response.
Well, I think that view of Israel being a sort of strategic partner in the U.S. domination of the Middle East was more true during the height of the Cold War than it is today. Again, this is ancient history for a lot of people, but in the 50s and 60s, the main divisions in the Middle East were between Arab nationalists who had a sort of left-wing tinge, but more importantly, were supported and allied with and armed by the Soviet Union, and U.S. clients in the Middle East, like the monarchies in the Gulf, which were rich in oil but very weak, militarily. And therefore, Israel was a very attractive partner as the sort of gendarme for the U.S. in the region, and that's partly has continued. It's one of the arguments that continues among people who try to make the case that it's in the U.S. interest to support Israel, not that we are paying tribute, in effect, to Israel. And it doesn't carry much weight anymore, frankly. When people make that argument, it's pretty clear that they don't have much belief in it or much basis for believing in it. But definitely during the Cold War, Israel was an asset. It could beat up on Arab countries that were allied with the Soviets, and that was obviously in the Cold War context a good thing. So that's my view. And like a lot of things, policy and attitudes don't change very quickly, right? There are what Krugman called these zombie ideas. So there's this zombie idea that Israel is really important for the security of the United States, and of course, most sensible people would argue quite the opposite. That it hurts the United States and creates enemies for us where we don't need them.
Yeah, let me add a comment here real quick into this discussion. When I asked Rania Khalek what is the impact of the Israel lobby on US policy, her response was basically that she thinks not that much, that US policy towards Palestine and Israel is driven by US policymakers thinking that it's in the interest of the US to support Israel, more so than the Israel lobby. So I just wanted to put that out there and maybe have you guys respond to that as well.
You want to take a shot, Phil?
Yeah, I have the opposite opinion.
Me too.
I think that when FDR met, I believe it was King Abdulaziz in 1945, the king of Saudi Arabia, he said, don't shelter Zionism because you'll alienate the oil producing countries. And FDR said, I'll never do that. So it was not in the quote unquote American interest to support Israel, yet we supported it from creation. So I think that, and that was true again in there was that period that Jeff describes in which in the Cold War, yes, Israel served as our aircraft carrier. It could sell itself as in American interest, but it never served our quote unquote oil interest over there. And then when the Cold War ended, Israel had to repackage itself as as the only democracy in the Middle East and our battlefront against radical Islam. So I think Israel has always had a sales job on why it's in the American interest, but that it actually goes against an American interest, and it's because the lobby has such power. But I don't want to get derailed.
I definitely agree with that. And you know, it's interesting that you mentioned FDR. First of all, the United States has never depended in a major way directly on oil from the Middle East, although American oil companies have profited immensely from sort of servicing that industry. But, you know, the transition from FDR's near on his deathbed, practically, you know, saying he wasn't going to cross the Saudis, to his successor, Truman, being, you know, recognizing the state of Israel the day before it was officially declared, you know, points out the lobby side of things. It's not that U.S. strategic interests had changed. Truman was quite frank in saying that he owed a lot politically to Jewish Americans who cared a lot about Israel and didn't have many constituents that cared about Arab interests and Palestinian interests, which was certainly more true than it is today. And explicitly, at least privately, it was admitted that the Jewish constituents that he was paying a lot of attention to were key funders of his election campaign. It was quite explicit at the time.
Yes.
There were a group of very, you know, strongly pro-Israel Jewish supporters who helped to finance his reelection, and he recognized that. And from his point of view, signing a letter that say, "I recognize Israel," was cost-free. Mm-hmm. And that's been, I think, one of the things that has changed since then. A lot of the power of the Israel lobby in the United States came from the fact that it had no organized opposition for many years. So it was essentially pushing on an open door. You know, it had a lot of influence, had a lot of money, but basically there was no other voice that any politicians, you know, had to listen to. And I think we're observing that as changing somewhat now. Absolutely. And we've had that experience. Those of you from Massachusetts will know that Senator Ed Markey, who is very progressive on almost every issue that we can imagine, except Israel, had considerable pushback. I don't know if you covered this on Mondoweiss.
We did, yeah.
But there were, you know, he made one of those bland statements about Israel's right to defend itself when it was bombing Gaza. And there was a real uproar among a lot of his supporters, including Massachusetts Peace Action, mm-hmm. which had endorsed him. So that's a big change now, that there are two sides, not just one side. Even though the one side, the old side, is still very powerful, it's not unchallenged now politically. So let's go to another question, Amar.
Yeah, sure. I'll read off two that are kind of related on this issue of the U.S. politicians again. Okay, hold on one second here. Alex is asking, do you feel Bernie Sanders was pushed out of the presidential race similar to Corbyn in UK because he mentioned treating Palestinians as humans? I guess more broadly, you guys can talk about the political cost of being pro-Palestine, if there is one. And then a similar question that Jeff, you might have kind of touched on in your last answer, but Mary is asking, can you guys comment on the positions of Massachusetts politicians, Markey, Warren, and the members of Congress?
So,
Phil.
I go first, then you do the Massachusetts. My response is, I mean, Bernie Sanders was out there on the Palestine question. I mean, his remarks from 2016 today look fairly timid about, you know, you don't have to love Netanyahu to death. You can criticize Netanyahu sometimes, he said. And today he would go much further. I don't think he was forced out of it didn't hurt him. I mean, it did not help him. And he lost to, you know, the party elite in what some said was a rigged process in 20. Without getting into that, I can say, yeah, it didn't help him. But I think that one of the interesting things is that that line, and Bernie Sanders is now not the furthest left in the Democratic Party. That's a great development that's happened. And right now they are trying to torch Ilhan Omar, the congresswoman from Minnesota, from Minneapolis, over the fact that she said that the United States and Israel are unaccountable for war crimes. Not so different from the Taliban and Hamas in that respect, she said. And in comments to Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State. And so people are trying to have her removed from House Foreign Affairs for this. And there was a time where a congressperson who said such things would get really drummed out of Congress ultimately. There would be a massive effort to get them out. There has been a massive effort to get Ilhan Omar out, but I don't think it's going to succeed, partly because she has a lot of friends. Finally, she has friends. She has people supporting her. John Yarmuth from Kentucky says she's getting singled out because she's Black and Muslim and a woman. I mean, there's been some real reinforcements for her from the left. And so in the past, these people, yeah, they were pushed out of politics. Charles Percy and suffered for it in Illinois. I think Paul Simon beat him over this question, or he got off his,
in Georgia, certainly also.
yeah, definitely. And that's not happening now. But Jeff, if you take it away, please.
So I agree, Phil, that that Bernie's sort of fairly moderate changes in talking about Israel were not the main thing that hurt him. It was, taking on the economic powers that be that really frightened the Democratic Party and their funding base. And what Bernie did and why he survived as long as he did, and the really scary thing for the establishment, is that he found a method of funding a political campaign that bypassed all of this big money in politics. And that's why he was not vulnerable, because he didn't depend on the big donors that the rest of the political establishment depends on.
That's true.
And that was a radical break. People like AOC, there are ways of running campaigns now that don't involve begging for tons of money from, Wall Street, liberals, pseudo liberals. And not that money isn't still important, and it isn't. I don't want to trigger anybody by mentioning money and Israel and Jews in the same sentence, but it certainly is, as Phil said, money from Jewish supporters of Israel is very key in both political parties. I mean, Sheldon Adelson was the poster child for the Republicans, but there are equivalents of that in the Democratic Party also. And it's not, one of the ironies of political campaigning in the United States is that before the Iowa caucuses, the first political race, of presidential aspirants is to go to Israel. As Nikki Haley was just there, a wannabe presidential candidate for the Republican nomination for president in the next election. It's been absolutely typical that politicians establish their bona fides to big donors by genuflecting, to the right people in Jerusalem, and that's still important. But there are ways to run political campaigns that don't depend on that money, and that's something new and radical and frightening to the powers that be.
All right. We have a few questions here. I'm just trying to figure out which one to kick over to you guys. Mike is asking a question. I understand it basically as he's asking, what do you guys think the Palestinians should be doing for their human rights to, end the occupation?
I guess my answer is I think they're doing a great job right now. There's a lot of people who are more negative about the progress, but I think right now Palestinian civil society has been pushing BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the South Africa process, and they have been they made that call 16 years ago to the world to support boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, targeting Israel over Palestinian human rights. I think it's an enormously effective campaign. Yes, it's been 15 years, but the recent apartheid declarations, they're by two human rights organizations with a lot of clout, B'Tselem in Israel and Human Rights Watch, the most important human rights organization in the world. Those apartheid declarations are going to fuel the BDS campaign. The war on Gaza, where 200 people were killed, over 60 children were killed for no reason, really. I mean, it's incredible that these lives can be snuffed out with no consequences. That is going to serve the boycott movement because people see the repeated violence that's happening as an answer to the Palestinian quest for freedom. And they're going to say, what does a non-violent means? BDS. So I am just in awe of that movement. And yes, people can criticize it hasn't done this, hasn't got a political program, whatever. I think it's done great. That's my answer. That's what you do to support Palestinians.
I mean, I agree. Although, as an American, I hesitate to stick my finger into the middle of Palestinian politics and their movement. But as an observer, I can say that there are some very interesting and encouraging developments lately. For one thing, the final discrediting of the negotiated peace process as it has existed, and the evident discrediting of the Palestinian Authority elite that grew out of it, is clearing the board a little bit for new forms of organizing and new forms of solidarity. And during this last Israeli attack on Gaza, a pretty new phenomenon was the kind of unity of the Palestinian communities, both those who have citizenship in Israel, those who live in the occupied West Bank, and those who live in Gaza, sort of beginning to speak with one voice and beginning to sort of establish the connections between them. And if there's anything that is scarier to the Israeli establishment than that, I don't know what it is. The fact that Palestinian citizens of Israel were demonstrating at the same time that the Gazans were resisting Israeli attacks, and that people were demonstrating against both Israel and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. This is a really new phenomenon, and I guess I want to take a minute to advertise. We're having a webinar next week with some Palestinian activists from Israel, 1948, as they refer to it. Amar, I wonder if you could put the link to that in the chat. We're going to be speaking live with some Palestinian activists in Haifa and elsewhere in partnership with an organization, Badil, which is based in Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank. So that's a really new phenomenon and quite hard to gauge where it's going to go, but it's very new. The fact that while Israel was bombing Gaza, Palestinians were protesting, sometimes violently, in the so-called mixed cities within Israel itself, in Lid and Ramleh and elsewhere. And I think if there's anything that's shaking the Israeli establishment, more than that, I don't know what it is. And there's a lot of hand-wringing going on over that in Israel now.
Okay, so I think we have time for a couple more questions before we close off the program. So,
you okay, Phil, with going on a little bit longer? Okay.
Well, I'm drinking water, so I'm not really, but
I hope,
you'll force
people watching are finding this worth hanging on a little bit more.
Great.
So let's let's take like maybe two more questions, and we'll see where we're at. Lynn is asking for it's kind of a general question. I think she's looking for some sort of insight about on the ground dynamics in terms of the settlements and the West Bank, what's going on like on the ground over there in Palestine and Israel, some sort of analysis.
I can't really offer an analysis besides the fact that a colonization project that began in the 1880s is continuing apace to this day. And today, Israel calls it Judaizing certain portions of the land. making more Jews on it, from the Galilee to Judea and Samaria, the biblical name for the West Bank, to Jerusalem. They're Judaizing. They're taking what was Palestinian homes, Palestinian villages, Palestinian urban areas, and making them Jewish. I mean, it's crazy. It's just a crazy thing that just continues. The one thing that I would, the one great thing that to where we're at on the ground, so that continues. There's more resistance, and the voices are getting picked up in America. Today, I had the pleasure of putting up this quote from Kelly Kobiea, a NBC correspondent in Jerusalem on the new government in Israel. She went to Sheikh Jarrah and she interviewed a young Palestinian about why he was protesting the evictions. And she said, they've been under occupation for more than 50 years and they want freedom. What more simple statement can there be of the Palestinian situation than what Kelly Kobiea had the courage to say? And I think it does take courage in the mainstream media to say that. And then to interview this young man who said, this is completely out of step with the 21st century, and it's at the hands of the United States. So I take inspiration wherever I can get it. And I just find it, I think this is, once you let those statements be made publicly in America, it's gonna, I think there'll be a I think America is getting radicalized because of the endless persecution of these people, just endless persecution. That's what I mean, there's no holding back on this. I mean, describing what they're undergoing. When you ask about facts on the ground, and Human Rights Watch said apartheid and persecution, anyone who has visited has seen persecution. And I think that's one of the reasons I work, why Jeff works, why many people on this call works, is that we've met Palestinians who are persecuted because of us. And that awareness is growing. So sorry to thump the Bible, but it's just.
No, that was great.
I just want to, add something that we won't be able to go into in detail, but one of the parallels and one of the reasons for the sympathy that Americans by default had for Israel is, of course, because we live in a successful settler colonial state, and until quite recently, that was almost never examined. I mean, people sort of knew it. Younger people anyway. I mean, Phil, you and I, got the Pilgrims and the, Cowboys and Indians and everything. But, today there's a much bigger awareness about what settler colonialism means at home where we live in Massachusetts. Obviously, we live in the state of Massachusetts that's named after a sort of defunct, native people that once inhabited this area. And that's being examined, and the parallels of settler colonialism in the United States and Israel, once you start to sort of look at them, are pretty intense. I mean, it's not an accident that the Pilgrims and the Puritans looked upon themselves as the sort of reincarnation of the ancient Israelites coming to the Promised Land in the United States. It's not an accident that almost every state in the Northeast has a Jerusalem or Salem or Sharon or Bethlehem or in New Hampshire. I used to live in Lebanon, New Hampshire, and just down the road was Canaan, New Hampshire, a little bit to the south. So, I think that's a factor among young people too, and sort of being able to put this together to understand what settler colonialism means, and the fact that as long as the Palestinians exist in numbers and are defiantly existing, it'll never be settled. Unlike, we were able to accomplish, we and European germs were essentially able to accomplish the near extermination of the native people in the eastern part of the United States. That's not going to happen in Palestine and the Middle East for sure. And young people sort of get that, I think, and that's going to be a political factor too. So,
great point.
All right, so I think I'll read off this last question for the night, and then we can close off the program. Noble is asking, in your opinions, how much damage have U.S. interests suffered from the U.S. quote special relationship with Israel and before its establishment with the Zionist movement? Examples: the Arab oil embargo, the Iraq War, and hostility vis-a-vis Iran.
I'm sorry, you were breaking up a little, Omar. Can you repeat what the beginning of the question?
In your opinions, how much damage have U.S. interests suffered from the U.S. special relationship with Israel?
Well, my answer to that is that the special relationship with Israel, the Israel lobby, and those are so little examined by American media and even by American scholarship that it gives rise to a certain mystification and ignorance and conspiracy theory, including, and so it's a little like that old story about the 9 blind men with the elephant. And you ask one of them, they say, "What's an elephant?" And one says it's a tough hide with hair coming out, and the other says it's a long, soft thing, and the other guy says it's a tail. And tusks. I think that the Israel lobby is the elephant in the room in Middle East foreign policy. It's not really looked at. And so therefore its powers are sometimes magnified. And my job, which is to look at the Israel lobby as I conceive it, I sometimes may exaggerate. That being said, I do think that the Israel lobby played a crucial role in the decision to invade Iraq, which is one reason I started my work. And I was so upset by the Iraq war, a massive error. And I think that was the Israel lobby helped force that. And since then, our role with Israel has hurt us in our relations with the Arab world. I mean, we have this bad relationship with a lot of people, including all these people we were fighting for in Iraq. And General Petraeus came back and said they've got pictures of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on their walls in Fallujah, and they say this is why they're fighting. I mean, that was suppressed in the American discourse. The fact that bin Laden was motivated by the occupation of Palestine, suppressed. So these factors are real factors. They have hurt American foreign policy. They've hurt the American image in the world. I imagine that Putin, even today, was saying, "What are you so upset about us occupying Ukraine when look what you're doing with Israel in Palestine?" I'm sure that came up. And so this kind of hypocrisy, so I think it's worked against American values and interests in a lot of ways, those specific ways, but that I sometimes magnify it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the Iraq War. I mean, it's there's no question that Israel and its supporters in the United States were part of the sort of agitation for that war, even though, as many of them said, it wasn't their preferred war. Iraq had already been pretty weakened by the first Gulf War, and their real target was Iran, which was their main sort of strategic adversary in the Middle East. But they said, quite frankly, any war in the Middle East is good, even if it's not the one we want, because the one we want will come after. And that was the plan, right? I mean, after Iraq, if that went well, the next dominoes were going to be Iran and Syria. And there's no question today, in terms of a threat, there's no question the U.S. would have some adversarial relationship with Iran, regardless of Israel. But Israel is a huge, sort of, push in that direction, a huge advocate for confrontation with Iran, because Iran is their last standing significant opponent in the Middle East. And if Iran goes, basically, Israel has no one to fear in the Middle East. And so Israel itself and their partners in the U.S. are actively pushing for confrontation with Iran and opposed to anything that will, lessen tensions with Iran, that Obama tried to do. And it's no accident that the initial negotiations with Iran to establish the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, had to be done under intense secrecy in Oman. And the reason for the secrecy was if Israel and the Israel lobby got wind of it, they would have done everything they could to blow it up before the agreement was signed, as they're trying to do now before the U.S. re-enters that agreement. So Israel and its supporters are part of the war party in the United States. If you don't want more wars in the Middle East, you have to oppose Israel's political influence in the United States.
I agree. Amen.
So I think we've maybe gone longer than we want. Phil, I really enjoyed this. You and I could go on for a long time.
Yeah, that's been a, well, let's re-adjourn, but let's meet up in person soon.
Yeah, I hope so. So, thanks so much for sharing your time with us, and just
My
let me
pleasure.
pass it on to Amar to sort of sign off on behalf of MAPPA. But Phil, thanks a million. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jeff.
I hope our participants who've been watching have gotten something out of it too. But it's been a pleasure.
hope.
A real pleasure.
Thank you. I've gotten a lot of, thanks, Jeff. Great
Okay,
questions.
Amar, take it away.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say the webinar you mentioned, Jeff, about the 1948 Palestinians. That I shared the link for the registration link for that in the chat, so people can register for that if they want. I mean, to sign us off for the night, I was going to give the last words to you guys, Jeff and Phil. Do you guys have any last words you want to leave our audience with to close us off for the evening?
I would just like to say that I admire your organization. We're in a terrible time of American history, and it's anti-war groups, that are like you guys that are in a great American tradition. And I just, it takes a lot of bravery, and it takes a lot of organizing and a lot of strength, and hats off. I appreciate it. You make me feel better about my country.
All right. Well, thank you, Phil. Thank you, Jeff. You guys had a great discussion, and I think we all enjoyed it and probably learned a lot. I'll email, or one of us will email out a video of this event. It's going to be posted on YouTube. So everyone, check out Mondoweiss. They have a lot of great reporting. You guys can find a ton of great work on mondoweiss.com, and follow Mass Peace Action on all our social media as well. So everyone, thank you so much again for your time tonight, and everyone, please have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.